He jumped in front of arrows to save the Apache woman, but every scar was worth it.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Arizona Territory, late autumn, 1882. The sun hung low, throwing long shadows across the broken land beyond Dust Vale Ridge. The dry canyon floor stretched out under a sky that had forgotten rain, and the wind carried nothing but grit and the sharp scent of sage. Elias Ward guided his gelding along a narrow trail, skirting the edge of a dry arroyo, reins slack in his left hand, a length of rope coiled at his hip. He wasn't a man prone to words or company. 41 years old, former Union scout, now a horse trader who preferred animals to most people. The war had ended nearly 20 years ago, but it still showed in the set of his shoulders, in the old scar that pulled under his left eye, and how he listened to the wind like it might carry a warning. He built a quiet life along the canyon's edge, mending fences, breaking colts, and keeping his distance from townsfolk who talked too much and listened too little. That afternoon, he'd been trailing 2 young horses that had broken through a rotted fence post down by the creek. He'd patched the fence 2 weeks ago. He told himself that, but the desert would splinters fast, and time's a fast rot. He'd been tracking hoof prints for the better part of an hour, slow and steady, figuring he'd corner them before nightfall. The canyon curved ahead, and as he rounded a sharp ridge, his gelding's ears pricked up. Elias stopped. There was movement beyond the bluff. Light rustling, then something heavier. He pulled the gelding to a halt and dismounted silently, crouched behind a cluster of mesquite and listened. His right hand hovered near his sidearm, more out of habit than fear. Then he saw her, a woman. She burst through the brush, barefoot, legs scratched, dress torn at the hem and shoulder. Her dark hair stuck to her sweat-soaked face, and she ran with the panicked focus of someone who knew what followed. Behind her, through the scrub and cactus, came the voices, white men shouting slurs, swearing, calling her a thief, a squaw, something less than human. And behind those shouts came the thump of hooves. Riders. One man lifted a bough. Elias saw it all in a second that felt much longer. The woman had maybe 20 yards between her and the arrow. She didn't know it was coming. He didn't think about it. He moved. His body reacted faster than thought, just like it used to in the war. He kicked his horse in motion, hard and fast. As the arrow flew, he leaned low in the saddle, arms stretched out, eyes locked on the woman. The shaft whistled past and struck his upper left arm. Pain tore through muscle, hot, immediate, but he didn't break stride. The woman stumbled. Elias reached down and caught her by the waist, yanking her up behind him with a single rough pull. She hit his back hard, arms wrapping around his middle in pure reflex, and he rode hard. He heard shouts behind them, but no more arrows, no more riders. Just his horse pounding the dirt beneath them, and the woman's grip tightening with every bounce. Elias pushed the gelding up through a narrow passage between the rocks, where the trail twisted enough to lose any riders behind them. His breathing grew sharp. The pain in his arms spread down into his hand, but he didn't slow. Not yet. By the time he reached the ridge near his cabin, the sun had all but vanished. The air had dropped 10 degrees. His jaw was tight from clenching, blood soaking through the arm of his trail coat. The woman hadn't spoken. She was still pressed against him, her hands cold. He rode up to the cabin, a simple structure of rough timber and stone tucked against the bluff like it was trying not to be seen. No one came out here. That was why he built it. He stopped the horse, swung down, almost lost his balance from the pain. He hissed through his teeth and reached up to help her dismount. She didn't resist, didn't speak. Her bare feet touched the cold dirt, and she swayed but stayed upright. Her face was streaked with dust and blood, but her eyes, sharp, dark, cautious, never left his. He opened the cabin door and stepped aside. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped past him. Inside, it was dim and plain. A small table, a hearth with cold ash, a bedroll near the fire pit. No luxuries. He hadn't made room for anyone else. He grabbed the kettle and filled it with well water, set it over the fire, and began stacking kindling. His wounded arm shook from effort. Blood was dripping onto the floor now. She watched him for a few moments. Then, silently, she stepped forward and pointed at his arm. Elias paused. He nodded. Let her. She approached slowly, still not speaking, but her hands didn't tremble. She found his knife on the table, cut the sleeve away gently, then took one of the clean rags from the crate near the wall. She poured hot water over it, wiped the blood away, then wrapped the wound with surprising care. Her fingers were calloused. She'd done this before. Elias studied her face while she worked. She looked about 24. Apache. Her dress, though torn, was finely made, beaded, fringed, once beautiful. Her braids had come half undone in the chase. Her body was thin, like someone who hadn't eaten right in weeks. When she finished, she stepped back and waited. Still not a word. He didn't ask her anything. Didn't press. He moved stiffly toward the hearth, coaxed a fire to life, pulled down a tin of beans and a heel of bread, set the beans to heat. Then he poured 2 cups of water and placed one in front of her. She drank. He finally sat, gritted his teeth. His arm throbbed, but it was clean now, wrapped. The fire crackled. She sat too, legs tucked under her, still barefoot on the plank floor, watching him carefully like she expected something else to go wrong. Elias didn't try to explain why he'd helped her. He didn't know how to put that into words anyway. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was guilt from the war, from the men he couldn't save. Maybe it was just that he saw her about to die, and his body moved before his mind could argue. Either way, she was here now, safe, at least for tonight, and that would have to be enough. The fire was low by morning. Thin smoke curled toward the roof where the heat had dried the pine boards near to cracking. Elias woke before light fully broke, same as always. His arm throbbed from the arrow wound, dull and deep now, not sharp like the night before. He pushed himself up slow, careful not to wake the woman still asleep near the hearth. She lay wrapped in the thick wool blanket he'd given her, legs drawn in, dark hair spilling across her shoulder. Her feet, still scraped and raw, were tucked beneath the hem of the blanket. For a moment, he just looked. She hadn't spoken a single word since he'd pulled her up on his horse, not even when she cleaned his wound. But he'd seen it in her, calculation, fear, grit. She hadn't run, hadn't cried, hadn't collapsed. She watched, waited. That kind of silence wasn't weakness. It was defense. Elias got up and stoked the fire with one hand, adding dry kindling and a log from the stack inside the door. His arm barked at the movement, but he gritted his jaw and ignored it. The cabin was cold this time of year. Nights dropped close to freezing. The first snow wouldn't be far off. He poured water into the coffee tin, ground the beans by hand, and set it over the flame. The scent spread slow, familiar. She stirred. Her eyes opened, not startled, not slow. Just open, as if she hadn't been fully asleep at all. She looked around the room, then at him. Still no words. Elias nodded once, a quiet good morning, and set the tin cup on the floor beside her. She sat up, keeping the blanket pulled close. He noticed she wasn't trembling now. Last night, she had been, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, he hadn't known. She took the coffee and sipped it carefully. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the wall near the window. Outside, the sky was a pale blue turning white at the horizon. The desert had that sharp winter quiet. No wind yet, but it had come. He finally broke the silence. You got a name? A pause. Then soft, barely audible, she said Sana. It hung there between them. The first thing she'd said. Elias nodded. Elias. That was all. She didn't ask him why he saved her, and he didn't ask her what she was running from. But they both knew the answer to both questions anyway. After breakfast, bread, the last of the beans, he went outside to check the fence. His arm was stiff, but usable. Sana followed without being asked. She didn't speak again, but she carried a bucket of water and set it near the horse trough without prompting. Then she helped him gather down branches from near the ridge, her steps light but steady, the deerskin dress brushing low over her bruised legs. Elias watched her out of the corner of his eye as they worked. She didn't move like someone soft. There was purpose in her hands. Care. She wasn't hiding who she was, Apache, proud, careful, but she also didn't offer it like a warning. Just moved through his space as if testing it, seeing if it would hold her weight. By midday, she had started cleaning the inside of the cabin. He hadn't asked. He didn't stop her either. She swept the dirt floor with a cedar branch broom, wiped the table, and even straightened the old blanket on his cot without saying a word. He let her. That evening, he boiled potatoes from the root cellar and gave her the bigger portion. She hesitated at first. Looked like she might refuse. Then she took it. He didn't ask what tribe she'd come from. He wasn't sure she'd tell him even if he did. But he knew enough to guess what had happened. An Apache woman, alone, hunted by settlers. It didn't take much to understand the shape of it. He'd seen it before back when he was a scout. Some raids, some false accusations, some folks looking to settle old scores by lashing out at anyone brown-skinned and close. But she wasn't telling him to fix it. She wasn't telling him anything. The day passed in slow routine. It was the first day in a long time that Elias hadn't eaten alone. That night, after supper, he sat on the cabin steps sharpening his knife under the starlight. Sana stepped outside, wrapped in the blanket. She stood beside him without saying anything. Then she sat, slow, careful not to press against him, and looked out across the desert like she was trying to figure out how far she'd come. Elias didn't speak, just handed her the blade. She took it, checked the edge, then handed it back. It was quiet, but it wasn't empty. And when she went back inside first, he followed after. Locked the door, banked the fire. As he lay on the cot, and she settled again by the hearth, Elias let his eyes close, knowing something had shifted. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was choosing to stay, and he didn't mind. The next few days passed in a rhythm neither of them named out loud. The kind of rhythm that builds without talk, made from shared motion, quiet observation, and the repetition of small tasks that slowly become familiar. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something like a beginning. Elias woke early each morning, pain in his arm dulled now, but still there, like a quiet reminder. He changed the bandage himself the first 2 days, but on the third morning, as he reached for the cloth and water, Sana stood behind him and took it from his hand. She said nothing, just dipped the cloth in warm water and began unwrapping the old gauze. Her fingers worked with care, steady and sure. He winced when she cleaned the deeper part of the wound, but didn't speak. When she finished, she touched the skin near the gash, faint, brief, but firm. Then she stepped back and returned to folding laundry near the fire. That was the first time he noticed the way she touched the scar like it meant something. Not pity, not apology, something quieter, a kind of thanks she didn't have words for. They rarely spoke, but there were looks, silent exchanges across the room. Glances passed while boiling water or feeding the animals or hanging meat to dry. Elias noticed how she always checked the windows and doors at dusk, how her eyes scanned the hills when she stepped outside. It wasn't habit. It was survival. She was still listening for trouble. That morning, he handed her his stitched trail coat. The seams under the shoulder had torn during the ride, and the fabric near the elbow was dark from dried blood. "You sew?" he asked, voice low. She took the coat without a word and nodded once. By noon, it was stitched clean. Not decorative, not showy, but strong. He thanked her with a nod. She returned it. Nothing more. Later that afternoon, Elias saddled the gelding and took a short ride toward the edge of the ridge to check for the missing colts again. He hadn't forgotten about them, though he'd stopped caring as much whether they turned up. When he came back, Sana was outside near the shed, breaking kindling into neat piles. She'd cleared a place beside the barn where he kept the gear, swept it too, without asking. He dismounted, tied the horse to the post, and looked at her. "You ever lived off alone before?" he asked. A pause. Then she said, "Yes." He waited. She didn't elaborate. He didn't press. Instead, he walked over and began splitting logs. She moved beside him and gathered the pieces into a crate. That evening, they sat by the fire as usual. A heavier chill had moved in, clouds crowding the stars, wind clawing through the cracks in the walls. Elias checked the windows again, hammered a new plank over the loose one by the east wall. Inside, it was quiet, the way it had always been, but not the same. Sana sat by the hearth, mending the hem of her dress, her legs tucked under her, the needle flashing in the firelight. Her hair was braided again, tighter this time, cleaner. Beads at the ends. Elias watched for a long moment, then pulled out an old keepsake box from a drawer in the table. Inside, beneath a folded bandana and a worn photograph of men he used to know, was a crow feather, black and fine. He had found it years ago near a battlefield, kept it without knowing why. He walked over, bent low, and offered it to her without speaking. She looked up. For a second, he saw something shift in her. Hesitation, surprise, maybe even the edge of emotion that didn't know where to go. She took the feather in both hands, looked at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said softly. The second thing she had said since she arrived. He just nodded and walked back to the table. Later that night, while she swept the corners near the hearth, Elias found himself staring at the door more than usual. He hadn't forgotten the men who shot at her. Drunk settlers didn't ride far sober, but they had horses and bad tempers. And worse, the law in Dustvale had no love for either her kind or his silence. He didn't know her whole story, but from the pieces she'd shown, he'd guessed enough. Her tribe had likely cast her out. There was no paint on her skin, no ceremonial markings, no family tokens in her braids. The beads she wore were modest, hand-tied, worn down. That wasn't ceremonial pride. That was someone who had walked a long way alone. Elias went to the cabinet and pulled out a second rifle. He checked it, loaded it, then leaned it by the door. When Sana saw it, she paused. "You think they'll come?" she asked. Her voice was soft, measured. He shook his head. "Don't know. Just in case." She nodded, like that was enough. Then she looked at him for a long moment. "If they do," she said, "I won't run again." Elias met her eyes. "You won't have to." They didn't speak the rest of the night. But in that silence, something had changed. The hunted girl was still there. But beside her now stood a woman who had decided. This time, she'd stay and fight if she had to. And Elias, who had lived too long thinking his quiet was all he had to offer, started to understand. Maybe the quiet wasn't empty. Maybe it was a place someone else could live too. ChatGPT soar. The wind changed direction by morning. It blew in colder, sharper, coming down from the high mountains where the snow already clung to the trees. The sky was pale and stretched thin over the desert, and everything beneath it seemed quieter than usual. Elias woke to that stillness and listened for the sounds he now expected. Barefoot steps on wood, the creak of the kettle, the soft rustle of someone moving near the fire. Sana was already up. He heard her outside, gathering more kindling from the lean-to near the shed. He sat up slow, arms stiff but healing. The bandage had to be changed again. He was reaching for the clean cloth when the door opened, and Sana stepped inside with a bundle of wood against her hip. Her hair was tied back in a tight braid today. A strip of leather knotted at the base, and the feather he'd given her was tucked into the band near her temple. Without a word, she set down the kindling and walked over. "I'll do it," she said. He nodded. "Let her." She unwrapped the old bandage. His arm had scabbed clean in places, but was still red and tender where the flesh had been torn open. She didn't wince. Neither did he. She cleaned it with boiled water, then pressed a fresh cloth against it. He watched her hands. How sure they were, how quiet. "You been trained?" he asked, voice low. Sana paused. "My mother was a healer," she said. He nodded once. "She teach you?" "She tried," she answered, almost bitter. "Before they married me off." Elias looked at her, but didn't ask. She wasn't offering more than that, and he wouldn't take it. She finished wrapping his arm, tied it snug, then moved to the hearth. Started boiling water again. The room filled with steam and heat. He sat at the table, watching her in silence, wondering for the first time what kind of life she might have had before this, before the running, the fear, the exile. Sana caught him staring, but didn't shy away. "You want to know what I did?" she asked finally. Elias leaned forward, elbows on the table. "If you want to say." She set the kettle aside, wiped her hands on her dress. "They promised me to a man, older than my father, wanted me quiet, obedient." Her voice didn't waver, just stayed even. I said no. My uncle took that as rebellion. Said I was cursed. The elders believed him. I left before they could decide what to do. Elias didn't blink. "That's not a crime." She looked at him hard. "It is if you're a woman." The words sat heavy in the air. She turned back to the kettle and filled 2 cups. "They told settlers I stole a horse," she added, "to justify chasing me. Settlers don't need much reason when it's someone like me." Elias nodded slowly. He understood. Maybe not in the same way, but enough. My family's gone, she said, either too scared or too silent to stop it. She sat across from him, eyes steady. You still want me here? She asked. He didn't speak right away. Then he said, I would not have brought you here if I didn't. That was the end of that. Later that day, while she hung wet linens outside and he hammered a new post into the horse corral, a figure approached from the West Trail. Elias spotted him first. Slim man, young, wearing a blue canvas coat and a wide grin that never quite reached his eyes. He waved as he got closer. Afternoon, the man called out. Elias didn't wave back. You're off the trail, he said flatly. I know, the man replied. Looking for a half-wild mare. Black coat, white mark on the nose. Might have gone east. Figured I'd check the ridge. Elias stepped between the man and the cabin without thinking. Ain't seen one. The man's eyes flicked past Elias, toward the hanging laundry, the faint outline of a woman just inside the cabin's doorway. Thought I saw someone, the man said. You saw me, Elias replied. The pause that followed was long. Tense. Then the man tipped his hat. Well, if you do see that horse, I'll be riding through Dust Vale next week. Elias didn't move. I'll remember. The man nodded once, turned, and rode off slow. When he was gone, Sana stepped outside. Her hands were still damp from wringing out cloth. You know him? She asked. Elias shook his head. But he knows you're here now. Sana didn't react. Just stood there, watching the trail long after the rider disappeared. That night, the tension lingered. Elias added extra logs to the fire, cleaned his rifle slowly, checked the windows again. Sana moved quieter than usual, but not out of fear, more like readiness. After supper, when the fire settled into low coals, she sat beside him for the first time, close, shoulder to shoulder. Her hand touched his where it rested on his knee. He looked down, but didn't move away. If they come again, she said, will you fight? Elias didn't hesitate. Yes. She nodded. Then I will too. For a long while they sat like that, together, silent, watching the fire crackle in the dark. Neither said the word home, but both were starting to wonder if that's what this place might become. Not just a place to hide, but a place worth defending. By the end of the week, the mornings came colder. The wind had turned bitter, pushing dust against the sides of the cabin and tugging at the seams of the roof. Elias fixed the drafty corner above the stovepipe with a new length of canvas, while Sana brought in the last bundles of dry mesquite wood from the shed. She moved like she had always belonged there, never waiting for instruction. She just did. The two of them worked side by side, same as the days before. She mended the pantry shelf while he checked the feed barrels. She boiled fat and lye for soap. He reforged the old shovel head in the back lean-to. Neither said much, but their silences weren't strained anymore. They just worked past tools, shared space. Still, Elias kept glancing toward the West Trail. The young man who had passed days ago hadn't returned, but the tension he left behind still lingered. Elias had been careful, watching the edges of the ridge each day when he rode to check the fences. The thought of someone from Dust Vale riding back with questions, or worse, hadn't left his mind. Sana noticed, of course. She noticed everything. You expecting trouble? She asked that morning, as he returned with the rifle slung across his back. Elias looked at her. Maybe. Should we leave? He thought about it. No, he said. Not unless we have to. She nodded. That was enough for her. That afternoon, as the wind settled and the last light dipped behind the canyon rim, Sana stood near the fire pit inside, turning a small pouch over in her hands. It was made of soft buckskin, worn at the edges. Elias noticed the way she held it, carefully like something personal. What's in it? He asked, not pressing, just quiet curiosity. Sana glanced up, then opened the drawstring and showed him. Inside were 4 small stones, each different in shape and color. One was smooth red jasper, another dark river rock, one flecked with gold, and the last bone white. My brother gave them to me, she said, before he left to marry into another band. Said if I carried them, I'd never be truly alone. You believe that? I did once, she said softly. Now, I don't know. Elias nodded and reached into the shelf beside the stove, pulled down a small wooden box. Inside was a scrap of blue cloth wrapped around a worn iron spur. The other one had been lost in Tennessee during the war. He held it up briefly, then put it back. Kept that damn thing through 2 battles, he said. Don't even know why anymore. Sana didn't laugh. She just gave a small nod, like she understood. That evening, after supper, he brought in 2 pine stools from the shed and set them near the fire. For the first time since she'd arrived, they didn't eat apart or in silence. He poured them each a tin cup of coffee and sat across from her. "Can you read?" she asked suddenly. Elias looked up. "A little." She nodded again. "I never learned." "We could change that," he offered. The way she looked at him, careful, almost skeptical, told him no one had ever said that before. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because I'm here." "You're here. Might as well." Sana looked at the cup in her hands, then back at him. "All right." There was a long pause, and then she said, quietly, "They called me cursed because I didn't want what was forced. Because I chose to walk away instead of obey." Elias nodded. "They ever hit you?" "Once," she said. "That was enough." He didn't respond. His jaw tightened, but he stayed still. She watched him for a moment. Then, for the first time, she reached across the space between them and touched his hand. Not soft, not romantic, just firm, present. "You don't have to fix me," she said. "I'm not trying to," he answered. Her thumb brushed his knuckles once before she pulled her hand back. Later, as the fire burned low, Sana stood, moved to the cot, and lay down, not by the hearth as usual, but across from him, close enough that he could hear her breathe. She didn't say anything when she pulled the blanket over her shoulders. But she didn't ask permission either, and he didn't move away. She was no longer just surviving here, and he was no longer just offering shelter. They were both staying night after night, not out of fear, but out of choice, out of trust. And in that cold canyon, with the wind rattling the shutters, that was the most honest kind of warmth either of them had known in a long time. The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of soft movement. Not alarm, not danger, just the quiet sound of someone making a fire. He sat up, his arms stiff from the night, and saw Sana crouched at the hearth, coaxing flame from last night's embers. Her hair was still braided, feather tucked neatly in, and she moved with the ease of someone who wasn't just passing through anymore. He pulled on his coat, slowly, testing the strength in his left arm. The wound was healing clean, but the muscle beneath still pulled when he reached too far or twisted wrong. Sana noticed and stood to pour him a cup of water. "You should rest it," she said, handing him the tin. "I have," he muttered. "Too much already." She didn't argue, but when he rose and reached for the hatchet, she stepped in front of him and took it instead. "I'll split the kindling today." Elias looked at her, really looked. Her cheeks were flushed from the fire's heat, and her eyes didn't ask permission anymore. They simply met his. Steady, direct. He let go of the hatchet and nodded. "I'll fix the latch on the corral," he said. "That gate's been drifting again." She gave a faint smile. That was how they spoke now. One gesture handing off to another, needs understood without a fuss. By mid-morning, the two of them had worked in near silence for hours. Elias repaired the gate, hammering the new iron latch into place, while Sana split kindling behind a shed. When she was done, she walked to the stream past the ridge to wash the smoke from her hands and brought back a strip of wild mint wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Elias without a word, and he added it to the stew he was simmering later that night. The rhythm they had built was no longer fragile. That evening, the wind picked up hard. Gusts shook the walls, and a cold front rolled over the canyon. Elias stacked extra wood inside, and Sana laid out their blankets near the fire. She moved her bedroll beside his without asking. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pulled off his coat, settled beside her, and let the fire do the rest. She was close enough now that he could feel the warmth of her breath against his shoulder. Her hand found his beneath the blanket, fingers cold but confident. He didn't pull away. He turned to face her, and she looked up at him. "I thought I'd forgotten how to want something," she said quietly. "Not food, not shelter, something more." Elias didn't answer right away. His chest rose slowly, his breath steady but heavy. "You're not the only one," he finally said. She reached up and touched the edge of his jaw, the rough scar beneath his eye. Her hand trembled just a little. He let her. "Your scar," she said. "Was it war?" He nodded. "Cold Harbor. Bayonet. She traced the line of it gently, then let her hand drop. I thought men like you didn't flinch. I do, he said, just not when someone's looking. She smiled faintly at that. Her hand settled back under the blanket, near his chest. There was no kiss, no whispered promises, but her body shifted closer, and he turned toward her. The way they lay, pressing against the cold, sharing heat, breathing the same space, said what words didn't need to. Outside, the wind screamed through the rocks. Inside, there was only stillness, warmth, and two people finally learning how not to be alone. Later, long after the fire had dimmed to glowing coals, Elias lay awake with Sana's head resting against his shoulder. He wasn't thinking about the men who had chased her. He wasn't thinking about the war, the ghosts, or the colts he never found. He was thinking about her, how she'd started weaving thread into her dress again, repairing the beadwork near the hem, how she tucked that feather behind her ear each morning like she'd been doing it her whole life, how she looked at him now, not like someone who owed him, but someone who saw him. He tightened his arm around her gently, and she moved in closer, her breath slow and even. The wind rattled the windows again. He didn't flinch, didn't move, because she was here, because they both were. The storm passed by dawn, but the cold stayed behind. Frost clung to the window edges in thin, jagged lines, and the sky outside was steel gray. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, leaving only soft orange coals beneath the blackened logs. Elias stirred under the thick wool blanket, still half asleep, with Sana's head tucked beneath his chin and her hand resting lightly over his ribs. She was warm against him, steady, and when he opened his eyes, she didn't move away. For the first time in years, he woke without that old pressure in his chest. No sense of waiting for something to break. No instinct to get up and move before the silence turned sharp. Just her present, breathing, sharing the same space like she'd always been meant to. They rose together, wordless. She moved to stir the fire while he rolled out of the blanket and reached for his shirt. His arm was healing clean now, the wound only a rough scar beneath the bandage. He tested it by flexing his grip and found it held. As Sana placed the kettle over the fire, she turned to him. "I want to ride out today," she said. Elias looked over, surprised. "Where to?" "Just past the ridge. I need to see it again, to know I'm not running anymore." He nodded. "I'll saddle the horse." 10 minutes later, the two of them were riding double, Elias in front, Sana behind, her arms around his waist. The air was crisp, the earth hard beneath the horse's hooves. They followed the narrow trail up the canyon wall, through the same pass he'd used to carry her out weeks before. The land looked different now, less like an escape route and more like part of something they both belonged to. At the top, Elias stopped. The horse breathed heavy beneath them. They looked out over the valley that had nearly killed her. The dry arroyo stretched far below. Sunlight touched the distant rocks, but the shadows were still long. Sana dismounted and stood near the edge, arms crossed. She didn't speak for a while. He stayed on the horse, giving her space. "This is where they saw me," she said, "where the arrow flew." Elias nodded. "I remember." She stepped closer to the ledge. "I used to think I'd die here. Or worse, be dragged back and made quiet again. You're not quiet now." She turned to look at him. "Not with you." That silence between them stretched, solid, not fragile. Then she said, "When you took that arrow, why did you do it?" Elias looked at her a long moment. "Because I knew you didn't deserve to fall in front of men like that. And I wasn't going to let it happen." She didn't respond, just walked back to the horse and climbed up behind him again. They rode back slower. When they reached the cabin, Sana stepped down and carried the saddle blankets inside while Elias rubbed down the gelding. As he worked, he thought back to something he hadn't spoken of yet, something that had sat in the corners of his thoughts since the day she arrived. At supper, while they sat at the table eating cornbread and stew, Elias finally broke that silence. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked. Sana looked at him evenly. "No." "Do you?" "No." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'll stay as long as I'm welcome." "You are," he said. "You always have been." That night, while the fire cracked and the wind stayed quiet for once, they lay beside each other under the same blanket, her back pressed to his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, and rested his chin near her shoulder. And then for the first time, he said it, quiet but clear. "I'm glad you're here." She didn't reply right away. Then she turned to face him, placed her hand over the old scar on his arm. "I love you," she said simply. "I didn't know how to say it before, but I do." Elias blinked, heart thudding hard once in his chest. He swallowed and nodded. "I love you too." The words felt strange on his tongue, not because they were untrue, but because they hadn't been said in years. They stayed close through the night, bodies pressed together in stillness. And in the morning, when the frost melted and the sky cleared, nothing had changed, except everything. 2 weeks passed. The frost gave way to thin snow, not thick enough to trap them in, but enough to blanket the ridge each morning in a coat of white that melted by noon. The cabin, with its low roof and wind-worn shutters, felt more like a home now, less a shelter, more a place they chose to stay. Elias added extra stones to the hearth wall to keep the heat longer. Sana patched the worn quilts and stitched new beadwork into the hem of her dress, clean, deliberate, her fingers steady. Each morning, they worked without needing to speak. Elias rode down to the creek to check the trap lines while Sana boiled water, cleaned pelts, or ground corn for bread. Some days she rode with him, sitting behind him with her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed to the back of his shoulder. When they returned, they ate side by side, shared the same plate, split the same piece of bread. No apologies, no awkwardness. One afternoon, Elias sat sharpening his knife on the porch while Sana hung the laundry from a line they'd strung between the shed and the barn. She paused, watching him, then walked over slowly. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. Elias looked up. "I had a baby once," she said. "Years ago. A little boy. He died before winter." She didn't flinch when she said it, but her voice had gone flat, like it had been pressed down for too long. Elias didn't answer right away. He set the blade aside, wiped his hands on his trousers. "I didn't know," he said. "I'm sorry. He wasn't sick. He was taken." She sat on the edge of the porch beside him, her fingers locking tightly together in her lap. "They said I didn't deserve to raise him, that I disrespected the band by refusing the marriage. They called it justice." Elias felt his throat tighten. He looked over at her, her face calm but distant, eyes fixed on the dirt path that led toward the canyon. "I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry," she added. "I tell you because if someone from that band ever comes looking for me, they won't come and talk." Elias nodded once. "Then we'll be ready." She looked at him. He didn't hesitate. "You're not alone here." Sana leaned her shoulder against his for a moment, said nothing more. That night, after supper, Elias walked out to the barn to check on the mare. The colt they'd thought lost weeks back had returned on its own, trailing behind the herd like it had never left. It stood quiet now, chewing hay, and Elias scratched its neck gently, his thoughts drifting. When he returned to the cabin, the fire was burning low and Sana was curled beneath the quilt. She looked up as he stepped inside, the light catching on the beads in her braid. "I've been thinking," she said, "if you ever want to go into Dust Vale again, I'd go with you." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Even after what happened there?" "I'm not afraid of them anymore," she said. "Not with you." He hung his coat near the door, crossed to the bed, and sat beside her. "You sure?" She nodded. "But only if you want to." Elias leaned down, brushed his lips against her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her mouth. A kiss, not hurried or shy, but full and certain. Her hand came up to hold his jaw as she kissed him back, deep and slow. When they pulled apart, she didn't move away. "I want this," she said softly. He looked at her. "I do too." That night, their bodies found each other without hesitation. They undressed slowly, carefully. He traced the shape of her shoulder, the curve of her waist. She touched the scar on his arm again, the one he'd taken for her, and pressed her lips to it. They lay together, bare and warm beneath the quilt, moving with trust instead of fear. No words, just breath, touch, and quiet understanding. They didn't rush. Nothing about this was for comfort or survival. It was want. It was earned. Later, as snow fell outside and the wind curled against the windows, they lay together tangled in silence. Sana rested her head against his chest, her fingers spread across the scar. "I never thought I'd have this again," she whispered. Elias tightened his arms around her. You do now. And she stayed right there, breathing with him until sleep took them both. By the time spring winds began to blow down from the high ridge, the snow had all but melted, leaving the land damp and scattered with wildflowers. Tiny blue blossoms sprouted through cracks in the hard earth, and the creek beyond the bluff was running fuller now. Birds returned to the trees. Everything felt different, alive again. And so did Elias. He stood outside the cabin, fixing the saddle harness with his left arm, still stiff but working fine. The scar across his bicep had healed in a thick, raised line. Sana came out behind him with 2 tin cups of coffee, one in each hand. Her deerskin dress was cleaner now, restitched along the hem with colored thread, her braids neat and tight. She still wore the crow feather he'd given her. "Fence still holding?" she asked. "Barely," he said. "We'll need to replace the posts by the north edge next week." She handed him the coffee and leaned against the porch rail. They stood in silence, watching the morning spread across the canyon. Below, a rabbit darted across the trail. The horses grazed quietly near the stream. "I've been thinking," Elias said, "about that trip to Dust Vale." Sana looked at him. "You want to go?" He nodded slowly. "We'll need seed, sugar, maybe salt. I've been putting it off long enough." She was quiet for a moment. "You think it's safe?" "No," he said, "but I think it's time." They left 2 days later. Sana packed light. Elias took his rifle and a pouch of coins he hadn't touched in over a year. They rode together on the gelding, saddlebags tied firm, boots dusted with dried clay from the trail. They didn't talk much along the way, but they didn't need to. The quiet between them had changed. It wasn't survival anymore. It was understanding. Dust Vale hadn't changed. The same cracked signs, the same saloon with warped shutters, the same livery with half-lamb headstock. But this time, Elias didn't feel alone walking through it. They went to the general store first. Bought flour, salt, lard, matches, tobacco. Sana moved through the aisles like she'd done it before, head up, steady. A few men glanced her way. One lingered longer than necessary. Elias stepped between them, eyes hard. The man looked away. They left the store without trouble. On the way back to the horses, a familiar voice called from across the road. "Well, hell, look who made it out of winter." It was the young rider from weeks back, the one who'd seen Sana that first day. He leaned against the saloon's porch rail, grinning with a mouth that had never earned a fight. Elias didn't stop, but he spoke low, firm. "She's not yours to look at." The man's smile wavered. "Ain't causing trouble. Just saying hello." Sana walked beside Elias, her chin lifted. Her hand grazed his elbow gently, a signal not to escalate. They mounted the horse and rode out of town without another word. Back at the cabin, the sun was low, and the wind carried the smell of pine sap and turned soil. Elias unloaded the supplies while Sana prepared supper. Inside, she moved easily now. This was her space too. She wasn't a guest anymore. Wasn't hiding. After they ate, Elias reached into the drawer near the hearth and pulled out a small tin box. He opened it and took out a simple ring, silver, smooth, unpolished. It had belonged to his mother, tucked away all these years. He held it out to her. "I ain't got the right words for it," he said, voice low, "but if you'd stay as my wife, I'd be better for it." Sana didn't speak. She looked down at the ring, then up at him. "You sure?" she asked. "I've never been more." She took the ring and slid it on without hesitation. "I've already stayed," she said. "Now I'll stay for good." Elias leaned in and kissed her softly, forehead, then lips. She pressed her hands to his chest and held him there, steady, grounded. Later, they lay curled together near the fire. Sana shifted under the quilt and looked at him with a quiet expression, something uncertain in her eyes. "There's something else," she whispered. "I think I'm carrying." Elias's breath caught. He looked at her, eyes wide, his heart suddenly pounding. "You're sure?" She nodded once. "Late by 2 moons. I feel it." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached out, laid his hand gently over her stomach. "All right," he said. "Then we billed for more than 2. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She only nodded and leaned into him, burying her face in his neck. They didn't need vows or ceremony. They had firewood to split, fences to fix, a roof to patch. They had land, breath, warmth, and now more life coming. And in a place where silence had once been a wall between two people, it had become a shelter instead. A place to live, a place to stay, together, for good.